Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're doing very well today on this fateful Monday, July the 13th, where we have been afflicted, or perhaps rescued, depending on your perspective, by several bans across multiple formats, but you're looking at the most impactful one here for our purposes, being modern-focused, and specifically BGX modern-focused on the channel. We are very much impacted by the ban of Arcum's Astrolabe, insofar as that it was the card to beat in Modern, right? It was the big engine, the big enabler, the big focal point of the most powerful deck in the format, and one that was in many ways a natural predator for our mid-range strategy. So we are very happy about this overall, but we do want to be thorough in our investigation of why the ban happened, what it means, and maybe also talking about other bans in absentia, bans that never were, cards that are now conspicuous by their continual presence in the format. So all of those topics kind of relate, they overlap, we'll get into all of that, focusing on Modern, but also at the end touching on the formats that I played before on the channel for you. I've enjoyed with you Pauper and Pioneer. I hope to enjoy them again. We'll talk a little bit about those, but the meat and potatoes of the channel and of this video, as always, is Modern. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you even more to my wonderful Patreon supporters. I hope this message finds you well. I hope you're cheering the news, and I wonder if you will agree with me that we could have and perhaps should have had a second ban alongside that of Astrolabe. As always, guys, you in the comments below will let me know. I look forward to reading that, and let's get into it. The question that I want to ask here is, number one, does Arcum's Astrolabe as a ban do enough? Is this really going to be that impactful of a ban? And number two, should there have been another ban? And if so, what other card or cards should have been the candidates for that other ban? It might sound like this is a kind of binary choice, like a mutually exclusive choice, but I don't think it is. I think it can be true that Arcum's Astrolabe is the most impactful ban that could be made, that could have been made, and is also, not to be underestimated, it is a very big nerf to this archetype, to the point where many people are saying it's totally dead, and they're going to go back to old-style control. But I don't think that's mutually exclusive with point two. It might sound like it is, but I really don't think it is, and as we talk about the specific cards, I'm going to explain why. So just to be clear, popular consensus was that Astrolabe would get banned, and it did, but popular consensus is that a lot of other cards from this archetype were problems and would also be likely potential bans today, and that did not happen. And notably, they also did not say that any other cards, whether it's these ones or anything else in the format, is on the watch list. So very, very interesting, but those cards were Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, and Mystic Sanctuary, and Vale of Summer. And as you can see, all of those are here in this more or less stock list, and that is definitely, those are cards we want to talk about, but in order to properly figure out exactly what the loss of Astrolabe will mean, and therefore how to evaluate whether the other UGX Snow cards are still going to be problems in the wake of that loss, we need to start by talking about Icefang Quall. Alright, so Quall is an insane card in the archetype, and is a major reason that they were able to stabilize and bridge the gap so consistently into that late game. Much like Astrolabe, Quall itself is a consistency tool just because it draws a card. The more cards you can draw early game, even if they don't provide selection, the more likely you are to not stumble. The more likely you are to curve out with your lands. The more likely you are to draw if not the entire right half of the deck, at least one card from the right half of the deck, especially in game ones, that you need to stay alive against whatever your opponent is up to. But beyond that, this card was such an issue to fight because it starts the 2-for-1 train in the UGX Snow player's favor right away on turn 2, because it's a cantripping, flashing, flying Death Toucher. But it is often a chump blocker if it does not have Death Touch, in which case it is not a 2-for-1 trade, in which case it is much, much less scary, right? So the major reason that this card is what we're talking about here is because if you read what Death Touch means, well, you need 3 other snow permanents to achieve Death Touch, right? And Quall itself is not one of them. Again, 3 other. snow permanents, so it is going to be a tall order to turn on Death Touch in any kind of a timely fashion for any kind of a traditional 3-color Bant snow deck, or Bant control deck, rather, as we knew them, because Arcum's Astrolabe number 1 provided a snow artifact in and of itself. It was just obviously very impactful, proactive turn 1 play that counted as one of those 3 that you needed. And number 2, like I pointed out when we looked at the deck list, it enabled that rich basic land count, that very high basic land count, and those are all, of course, snow basics. And those 2 things are both gone now. Astrolabe, both directly by the presence of the card itself and indirectly by enabling the snow basic land base, was an enabler for Death Touch on Quall, and without Death Touch on Quall, we are in a lot of trouble if we are trying to stabilize against aggressive decks attacking with creatures to get over the line. Quall is much more underwhelming, and if you look at the other cards that blue-white and, I guess, green decks in the control category traditionally tend to play, well, like I said, they're not red, they're not black, they don't have those early efficient 1-for-1 trades like Inquisition, Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, so on and so forth. So the trade-off with the blue-white color pairing has always been bad early interaction for the most part, especially in a format as diverse as Modern, where you cannot be sure that a card like Spell Snare is going to be well positioned, in exchange for their overwhelming late game. But with the snow sub-theme enabling everything, they got to have their cake and eat it too. That is no longer the case. So we understand that Astrolabe is both directly and indirectly a big loss, and what does that mean for the 3 cards I highlighted? It was Uro, it was Sanctuary, and it was Vale of Summer that were 3 other potential ban list candidates for today. So let's begin by talking about the big guy, by talking about Uro. Let's be clear, this card is absolutely nutty, and it was enabled in some ways by Astrolabe, specifically because that escape cost is a little bit tough. To that end, I actually think it's okay to leave Uro alone, even though I think he's ridiculously powerful. I think, despite how heavily Uro is played, I think most people still underrate this card in terms of simply how powerful it is in a vacuum and in the context of most any deck that would reasonably choose to play him. However, we do have to say that maybe the structure of the deck does not accommodate him as much. But what I think is going to happen is probably that this is still a major incentive for control players to reach for. So if they have any incentive at all to play green, they will find a way to accommodate Uro's escape cost. And if they have to play more early game interaction, which is a good thing, in the wake of Astrolabe being banned and Quall being indirectly nerfed, then I think they will be taking away from other different top-end game-ending threats and keeping Uro as a major focal point of the deck. So I understand why people still want it on the ban list or thought it might be a reasonable ban candidate, and I think it's going to continue to dominate Modern, frankly. I think it's going to continue to see a ton of play. But that said, it does take a bit of an indirect hit from the banning of Astrolabe, to be sure. The next card to talk about here is Mystic Sanctuary, and this card is entirely obnoxious. It is egregious to play against. I cannot believe it was printed. However, and it has been banned in Pauper, so much rejoicing there. I did feel, as I wrote on a Patreon post, I did feel a Sanctuary ban in my bones, but I said it's probably more like Pauper than Modern, where we're going to see it get the axe, but I did feel it had to go somewhere, and I thought it was at least possible that it would get banned in Modern, but it did not. And frankly, as much as I hate the card, I am okay with that, because the things that I just said for Uro, where it does take some kind of indirect splash damage from the banning of Astrolabe, that's actually much more true for Sanctuary, as far as I can see. And again, I'm not a control player, so take this all with a grain of salt. If you have countervailing views, please do air them below. But it was frankly ridiculous how Arcum's Astrolabe enabled Mystic Sanctuary, because again, this was just another free roll inclusion with Astrolabe knitting all of the mana together, filtering into whatever you needed. It was very easy to accommodate all of those basic lands, most of which were islands, and most of which coincidentally make Mystic Sanctuary way better. Mystic Sanctuary is an insane card in the context of control decks. If you've ever played against it even once, you don't need me to tell you about that. And the fact that it can be fetchable is just insult to injury here. It's an insane card. It should never have been printed, frankly. But I will say that 3-color decks, and certainly the 4-color decks that some people were also playing in the heyday of Snow, can no longer free roll this card. It is now a card with a more genuine downside, as it should be, because a card with this level of power and this level of feel bad, because it does feel very bad, it is very miserable gameplay to be locked out under a Sanctuary Cryptic command loop. Well, it has to come with a tangible downside, and now in the 3 and 4 color decks, it's going to enter the battlefield tapped a fair amount more than it otherwise would, and that is a real tangible downside. And if you happen to draw it early on and you happen to be dependent on it for your early game progression, maybe that will be a downside too, both in terms of having to deploy it tapped and in terms of it not being able to be filtered into whatever you need by the formerly ubiquitous Arcum's Astrolabe. So in that sense, having said all of that, I do think that it's fine to let this card continue existing, even though many people thought it might be banned today. And even though I definitely wouldn't be sad to see it go, I think of the 3 cards we're talking about, this one is hurt the most by the ban of Astrolabe. And it also, finally, this is now a card that incentivizes 2-color and maybe even 1-color control decks, you know, the madmen trying to play mono blue control out there, but certainly the 2-color control decks, classic blue-white control, can leverage Mystic Sanctuary better than 3 and 4-color piles. But here, my friends, here's where I've got to go off. Vale of Summer, my most hated card. It is time for my quarterly or monthly or perhaps weekly, maybe even daily, anti-Vale of Summer rant. This card is not really hurt almost at all by the banning of Astrolabe, other than just generically the fact that it is the most powerful sideboard card overall, I would say, in the most powerful deck in the format. So yes, obviously the archetype as a whole gets nerfed, I understand that, but beyond that, unlike Errol, and especially far unlike Mystic Sanctuary, Vale of Summer is not really rendered any worse by the absence of Astrolabe in terms of direct synergy. You know, technically, yes, it is nice for the control player off of a basic island to be holding up Vale of Summer or representing Vale of Summer with an untapped Astrolabe. I get that, I understand that, but beyond that, Vale of Summer is not really a synergy card. Vale of Summer sees play in the sideboard, as we saw, of control decks, but also in the sideboard of fair mid-range decks like Green-Black Rock, and also in the sideboard of combo creature decks like Infect, and fair green creature decks, such as they are, which are not very common in the format any longer, and also in the main deck of combo decks like Neobrand, and in the sideboard of combo decks that were otherwise playing every color but green, like Ad Nauseam, and the list goes on and on and on. Vale of Summer is quite simply a card that should never have been printed or conceived of, or passed playtesting, or lasted in any format for more than a week, if you ask me. And beyond that, it is a card that, as I say, is not really crippled by the loss of Astrolabe. Any deck that plays green is still going to basically want this card with very, very few exceptions, and it is going to continue to do what it has done since its introduction, which is in an era where the threats are too powerful and the answers are not good enough and the interaction is already not good enough, Vale of Summer will specifically and savagely punish you for trying to interact in traditional ways. That is discard, permission, and removal. Those are the kind of historic touchstones and characteristics of black and blue, respectively, as colors. Vale of Summer says you're an idiot for trying to play Inquisition of Kozilek or Fatal Push or Monolith. Why don't you just play Uro instead, right? So anyway, Vale of Summer rant over. That is why, oh, well, it's not over. That part of the rant is over. Now it's analysis time, ban list analysis time. This is why I predicted a Vale of Summer ban alongside an Astrolabe ban, and obviously I was incorrect with that. Partly, yes, I was trying to meme it into reality, but I also was genuinely thinking, this is the time to get Vale of Summer. Everybody knows Astrolabe is going to get banned, and most people are expecting a second ban. Most people are also hungry for a second ban, but we don't want to directly necessarily punish the snow decks and the snow decks only too hard, right? And like I just explained, Uro and especially Sanctuary do take some collateral damage, both directly and indirectly, from the banning of Astrolabe in a way that Vale of Summer does not. So, all of that, in addition to what I just said about the card in the vacuum, meant that this was the perfect time, in my view, to ban Vale of Summer. Sadly, the card remains to haunt our waking nightmare and our dreams as well. So those are kind of my thoughts on the ban and the bans that never were. And as always, I look forward to your thoughts on that. But what happens now to the meta? Well, you're looking at Jund, you're looking specifically at the Discord Jund list provided by Maybe Lotus's Dan that we played in the Discord Jund video as a collective. It was super fun. If you haven't checked that out, I really encourage you to do so. It was definitely a unique first on the channel, but I'm showing you it here because, hey, you know what? I think Jund is now probably the strongest fair deck in the format. It certainly has a case to be made. We have seen historically that in the recent past, basically since Modern Horizons, a three-color deck has more or less always risen to the top of the fair deck piles in Modern. And, fair versus unfair is increasingly an obsolete dichotomy, an obsolete way to describe, like, what is desirable and what is not in Modern, if you ask me. But for the purposes of illustrating the point here, while many people say that Gruul is poised to be the best kind of mid-rangey or control-y deck in the format, and that might be the case, I do want to throw out that Jund is looking very, very strong right now. Another deck that I think benefits in an indirect way from this ban is this one. It is Rakdos Skelemental. I think this is a really cool deck. I think it's pretty powerful. I think it's a bit of a sleeper in the format, and broadly speaking, when the three-color value pile that is very, very hard to outgrind for other fair decks is dethroned, you can expect to see two-color decks fill the void to a little bit, partially because they have lost a Predator, and partially because the more specialized nature of the two-color decks can maybe be really capitalized upon, while their inherent weakness of not being as grindy as the three or sometimes four-color piles is at least temporarily abated. And I think, especially if big mana comes back onto the scene in a big way, Rakdos can prey upon big mana. Rakdos can now grind with most things in the format now that Bant is gone, or Bant is reduced in power and stature. And again, I do think this is just kind of an intrinsically powerful bit of a sleeper deck in the format, and I had a really fun time on my debut with it. I hope to revisit this soon. And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention good old Rock, partially because it is near and dear to my heart. It is still my favorite archetype in Modern, but partially because the two-color kind of analysis that I applied to the role of a deck like Rakdos in a changing format that has just recently deposed a three-color value terror, that two-color window of opportunity might also open up for Rock. Now, just to be clear, I'm just showing you recent lists that I played. I have not tuned these lists with the ban list in mind. These are pre-ban configurations, and I think this Rock list would be likelier to change more drastically in anticipation of a different meta and of the reduced need to try to compete somehow with Bant Snow than the other two lists I just showed you. So these are just for fun, just for purposes of illustrating. I have not tuned these lists for the current meta, but I do think that Lurrus of the Dream Den in good old-fashioned green-black Rock is definitely ready to carve out more of a niche for itself in the meta than it's had in a little while. And on top of that, it has actually been doing pretty well, even when a lot of things were stacked against it. Finally, if we expect a big boost in Burn and Prowess, which are number one, very strong already, number two, always going to appear when the meta changes in the wake of a big ban, and number three, do directly benefit from Uro perhaps not being quite as ubiquitous as he used to be. And even if he is, they will benefit from the lack of all of those painless basic lands in all of those snow-covered decks. That will be a thing of the past that maybe Burn and Prowess can capitalize on. But the best deck, the best mid-range deck, that is, to beat up on Burn and Prowess, you're looking at it. It's good old rock. So just to wrap up, talk a little bit about Pauper. I have just started dabbling in Pauper. I haven't played that much of it, and frankly, I was turned off hardcore by the Flicker decks, by the Tron decks, which are kind of one and the same, but there are other Flicker archetypes that do not play Tron. I also, if there was a second least favorite thing that I encountered besides the Flicker loops and Pauper, it would have been the card Mystic Sanctuary out of blue decks. Don't generally mind playing against the blue decks and Pauper, but specifically Flickering and specifically Mystic Sanctuary are two just miserable cards to face in that otherwise very restricted format in terms of the singleton powerful cards that are out there, right? So I'm a Pauper noob, but as far as I can tell, these bans are awesome. I've been reading that some people think that something besides Expedition Map should have been targeted against the Tron decks. I can't really speak to that, but I am glad that Sanctuary is gone, and I'm very glad that something from the Tron decks and subsequently, therefore, the Flicker decks has been hit. And Expedition Map, I don't know. Just my modern experience tells me that that is an insanely powerful card in the context of Pauper, so I think again, as a Pauper noob, I see no reason to really complain about that banning. And then there's Pioneer, and I think this blindsided everybody. I have not been in touch with Pioneer, so maybe that's more of a general impression rather than something where if I'd been talking to a lot of people about it and going over the discussion with a fine-tooth comb, I would have seen some dissenting opinions, but I think almost everybody expected a ban here, right? And we didn't get one. We got an unban. We got Oath of Nissa unbanned. It's the last thing I think that most people expected. I don't know. Right now I'm kind of cold on Pauper, and a lot of people are too. Events are failing to fire, despite circumstances conspiring to make online play kind of the only competitive avenue right now. You still have Pauper challenges failing to fire, which is very alarming. But for me personally, I was excited about about Pioneer when it was first announced, but when we look at the design trends, they're concentrated. The ones that I don't like are mostly concentrated in recent years, and therefore Pioneer is uniquely kind of falling victim to that because you don't have some of the powerful older cards to balance out some of the newer mistakes that, as I've said before, are very threat-heavy, very value generation-oriented, and therefore, for me, Pioneer has just kind of been like, I'm not really that motivated to play it. I don't even really care so much that combo decks are that popular. It's just a matter of the combo decks being very value-positive at the same time. That's what's rough. Okay, my friends, so that was kind of my treatise on the Arcum's Astrolabe ban in Modern and the assorted ripple effects that will have throughout the Bant Snow archetype, as well as, therefore, the Modern format as a whole, and also about the bans that never were. Again, in conclusion, I think we should have banned Astrolabe and we should have banned Vale of Summer. The thing I'll finally touch on here is that a lot of people were expecting unbans. I did make a last-minute speculation, just in case. I just picked up my Groves of the Burn Willows and my Punishing Fires, just because I need them for Jund, just in case it got unbanned, but I really didn't expect any unbans. Doesn't seem like the expected time for those, and indeed it was not the case, but I was really thinking now's our time to get rid of Vale of Summer. It didn't happen, so the Grimflayer's a little bit heartbroken about that, but I am pretty much pumped about the Astrolabe ban. I hope nobody out there is disappointed in it. Maybe there will be one or two of you, but I think this is a very popular, very safe, and very reasonable ban for Wizards to have made. So that was my spiel. As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and as always, I thank you for watching.